Okay, time for our final paper presentation. As a reminder for folks here, any new people in the room, please silence your cell phones. And as with the rest of this session, this is all being recorded. Our final presentation is Form from Function, applying flow-driven experiential learning to the integration of immersive technology in formal military aviation training programs. Our presenters are Lieutenant Colonel Nancy Taylor and Dr. Andrew Clayton. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor is an active duty C-130 pilot and experienced instructor evaluator on multiple aircraft platforms, including the C-130, T-1A, and T-37. He's currently on air staff at the Pentagon working mobility plans and programs. Served as the executive officer to the commander, 18th Air Force, Scott Air Force Base, and she is currently a career mobility pilot and commanded the 714th Trading Squadron, Little Rock Air Force Base. Dr. Clayton serves as an assistant professor at the Area University, where he teaches and researches on topics related to the leadership and experiential learning. He has served on the United States Air Force on active duty and in the Air Force Reserve as a lieutenant colonel. He served as a master instructor, course director, program manager, and academic advisor for 12 years, more than 8,000 hours of classroom instruction airtime at Area University. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Taylor and Dr. Clayton.
Well, good morning. Thanks so much for the introduction. As you heard, a lot of background in instruction, slightly different areas. Dr. Clayton's done a lot of classroom instruction and leadership, some other doctrine there as part of Air University, and then very near and dear to my heart is aviation instruction. So that's really sort of the genesis for the work we did, and we're real excited to talk to you about it, just about how we think you can apply flow theory and the experiential learning model to the use of immersive technologies in formal military training programs. So during our presentation, we're going to talk to you a bit about why we think this is a valuable topic for research, and then hopefully we're going to prove to you that it is with an explanation of our proposed model. We call it Flow-Driven Learning Experience Design. We're going to follow the breakdown of the model with an existing case study that really is going to show you the need for the framework and how it could be applied in a lot of different areas. So to talk us through the why is Dr. Andy Clayton.
Thanks, Nancy. Okay, so the why. This rapidly advancing world of immersive technology really has allowed educators and designers to kind of ponder the impossible to be possible, especially within education and training. The Air Force has really seen a spike in immersive technology, especially within pilot training and maintenance training next. But the Air Force is also showing other areas of expanding this use of immersive technology into other various military training programs. However, the process and framework to identify which training and learning objective or event are most beneficial to reach through an immersive learning environment versus potentially a traditional learning environment has not had similar attention. So this led Nancy and I to kind of research and kind of develop what we call a new framework called Flow-Driven Learning Experience Design, or the FLEX framework. But before we actually get into the framework, we want to kind of have a little bit of a difference in understanding between what we call ISD, Instructional Systems Design, which most of you probably have heard of in education, and compare that to learning design experience. So we acknowledge that there's a difference between the two, but that in any formal training program, the use of ISD is always a requirement. But the FLEX framework is not intended to replace the ISD process. It really is to work in tandem with the ISD process. However, there is a fundamental difference between ISD and what we call the FLEX framework. That major difference really is what they both focus on. The ISD has a very strong focus on the end goal of the instruction, the end performance that participant or student graduates from in that formal training program. What is that end performance for the student? LXD, or Learning Experiential Design, focuses on understanding what the participant is feeling through that instructional process to meet that end goal. So this is the big difference that we look at. ISD focuses on the performance, while our framework is focused on the experiential process. This was the driving factor and purpose really behind developing what we call the FLEX framework. So Nancy will now kind of describe to us a little bit about that FLEX framework.
Right, as Andy just talked about, FLEX is focused on the experience of the individual learner as they go through the instructional process. So it's necessarily then not a step of a number of steps in a checklist that you get to completion and you're done. It's cyclical and continuous as the learner goes through the learning process. So at the center of FLEX are the 4 stages of Kolb's ELT, which probably every good ISDer is going to be super familiar with. So you've got active experimentation, experience, abstract conceptualization, and reflective observation. So around that center, we've surrounded it, and we say they should be shaped by the principles of flow theory, which might be a newer concept to some of you. We're going to talk about it more later, but the three principles that really are core to flow are establishing clear goals and expectations, and you'll see that on the triangle in the middle of our model, providing direct and immediate feedback, and balancing a student's ability with the current challenge that you're presenting them. Finally, the criteria of transactional distance theory, structure, dialogue, and learner autonomy underpin our framework by providing really the necessary structure when you're developing distance education, and we related that in the case of our paper to immersive learning.
Thanks, Nancy. So we're going to kind of break down the framework. So the big three that Nancy talked about, experiential learning, flow theory, and transactional distance theory. First, we're going to focus on the experiential learning theory of our framework. So the first part of the FLEX framework really is that experiential learning. When developing an integrated immersive technology into a formal training program, we need to examine the learning process through these 4 stages. And so like the ISD process, where understanding that objective is what you're trying to achieve, within the FLEX framework, understanding the type of experience is important, and what that experience will provide to the participant is vital to what, when, where, and how that educational experience impacts the participant. So if we walk through this stage, the first stage of experiential learning is really that experience. There's concrete, there's individual and abstract experiences, and even social experiences a participant can go through. This is really the foundational question of the FLEX framework. What is the purpose of the experience? What type of experience is desired for the participant? This question really is ambiguous to whether the training program is in a virtual environment or immersive technology, or even in a traditional environment. So this framework works for both. If we look at the second stage of experiential learning, we talk about the reflection process. And this will be important as we look at flow theory and transactional distance theory. Introspection and reflection from experience forms the beginning of either transactional or transformational learning. As that participant goes through a formal training program, another vital question that we must ask then is that student going through transactional or transformational learning? And this is done through reflection. The result of a training program for that participant must reach what we call self-efficacy, or a belief that he or she can apply the skills they have learned from that training program to the expectations of their career field requirement if you're thinking through the military. So self-efficacy then is a result of reaching transformational learning. And as we will see in other aspects of our FLEX framework, the requirement of self-reflection is needed regardless of whether the training program is in immersive technology, such as virtual reality, or in a traditional environment. So then if we look at the next stage, we're talking about the abstract conceptualization, where that participant makes the connection from the experience to the content of the training program. So for example, in our Maintenance Training X case study, we take a crew chief that's getting trained to become a crew chief on the flight line in the Air Force. If the participant recognizes that the importance of following, let's say, a maintenance technical order when completing the maintenance of the aircraft, that is connecting the experience to reflection to the abstract objective, which is use the TO to do the task on the flight line. The question then for the FLEX framework is, how are those connections being established for the participant? Is it done in virtual reality or in a traditional environment? Are those connections supported within immersive technology or in that traditional environment as well? So these types of questions will be discussed later with Nancy as we describe some of those other aspects of FLEX through flow theory and transactional distance theory. But then the student must demonstrate that behavior again, which is the last stage, experiential learning of active experimentation. This is the stage where the participant must test the new ideas, and whether that new idea is tested either in virtual reality or immersive technology, or in that training traditional environment. Which one do we use? So that is the question that we pose. Where do those new behaviors get demonstrated? Does the participant do them in virtual reality or a traditional environment? How is that participant going to be assessed? In a virtual reality, immersive technology, or that traditional environment? So does that require an individual to complete that task through the assessment also in virtual reality or a traditional environment? These questions we pose from experiential learning support both immersive technology and traditional training program. So experiential learning tells us that it is not the technology that will determine the self-efficacy of a training program, but it's the framework of the learning experience design, which starts with experiential learning, and which is part of our FLEX framework. So as we move forward now, we'll start to dissect the other aspects of our FLEX framework, starting with flow theory, which we'll pass over to Nancy.
Thanks, Andy. So Andy's just explained how the stages of ELT make up the foundation of our flexed model, really the center there that you see in our rectangle. Next, I'm going to talk through what we propose should drive those stages, and we say it's the idea of flow or flow theory. So flow theory is an idea that presents a concept for achieving and sustaining optimal learning and performance. It really doesn't have to just be in an academic environment. It's talked about a lot in athletics, tons of different areas. But it's about sustaining optimal learning and performance by considering the learner's affective state. Again, learner-centered. According to Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, kind of the father of flow, it's achieved under the following conditions. 1, that clear goals with defined rules and expectations are established for the learner. 2, there's an opportunity for direct and immediate feedback with the purpose of adjusting the required behavior or the desired behavior. And 3, that there's balance, and we talked about this earlier, between the challenge presented to the student and their current capability. So to understand why this occurs really only when the above conditions are met, it's useful to look at flow in terms of what Csikszentmihalyi says are the 2 most important dimensions of the experience, and I've said it a few times, but challenges and skills. It's only when the learner is appropriately challenged based on their skill that flow occurs. So you can use a billion different examples. The one that Andy and I came up with to explain what this really means, it's pretty simple, is by using a game of catch. So 2 people standing 5 feet apart, never played catch before, but 5 feet's pretty reasonable. They're going to throw the ball back and forth, they're going to drop it a few times, but eventually they're going to consistently catch it over and over. And then 1 of 2 things is going to happen. They're either going to get bored or they could increase the challenge, right? So they've learned how to throw that ball 5 feet apart. So they get bored and walk away, but it's our job to challenge them and say, hey, how about you move 5 more feet apart? Now you're 10 feet apart. You're going to throw the ball between each other, you're going to drop it a few more times, and eventually you're going to get proficient. You're going to get really good at that. So again, they can become bored, or we again challenge the learners to do something a little bit more difficult. We separate them further, we put them on different levels, something to challenge them and keep them interested. So now, the challenge has increased, interest is still there, and they're operating at a higher level. So the idea here could translate to any learning environment. That cycle could, in theory, repeat indefinitely, with the ultimate goal of guiding the student back into flow at a higher capability or level of complexity.
Awesome. Thank you, Nancy. And to add on to this flow theory, there are 3 conditions that we look at. So as Nancy mentioned, flow theory focuses on that relationship between the skill and the arousal of that skill. So if the challenge or skill you're trying to achieve is too difficult or too easy, then the participant could become frustrated or bored. So when we look at the conditions for flow theory, you must first understand what is the skill or objective we're trying to reach within the participant. Sounds very similar to the ISD process. What is the objective you're trying to reach? How difficult or challenging is that skill to the objective? But before we even look at that, we must contemplate whether that skill or objective should also be accomplished in immersive technology or the traditional environment. So that objective is important for us to look at. The objective, along with feedback and dialogue, which we're going to talk about here in just a second through transactional distance theory, is also supported by flow theory, and the balance between that challenge and the student capability will begin the determination of self-efficacy in the training program. So to further illustrate this understanding, we're going to look at the factors around the dialogue within the flex model, which Nancy will talk about.
Okay, so we've talked about ELT, which we say should ground the design, and flow, which we say should drive it. But in order to be effective, what Andy and I also considered was Ehrlich's 4 criteria for virtual learning. So what are the 4 things that should exist so that you can learn in a virtual environment? How's it a little bit different than an in-person environment? So learner interaction with the immersive technology, how's that going to happen? Application of the curriculum within the immersive environment. There needs to be an opportunity for learners to learn from other learners, and finally an opportunity for learners to learn from the instructor. And all of these can be a little more challenging if we're in some sort of mix of a virtual environment. So applied through Flex, the concepts of ELT flow and transactional distance theory, which Andy's going to walk us through next, ensure that criteria for virtual learning are met.
Awesome. Thank you, Nancy. So yes, let's move over to the third part of our model, which is transactional distance theory. All right, so transactional distance theory really helps us to further understand how participants may reach self-efficacy. Additionally, during transactional distance theory, the Flex framework expands on understanding the affective state of the participant. So transactional distance theory allows us to understand the relationship between the participant and the task at hand. So that relationship between the participant and the task will determine how transactional the learning will become. the goal of the Flex framework is to determine how to create the most effective and affective experience, which comes from transformational learning. So this is done through two major components of transactional distance theory, which is structure and dialogue, which we've kind of talked about within flow theory. When the structure of a task or event becomes more structured or potentially more complex, and the dialogue between the participant and others becomes less, the more transactional the learning becomes. This is called transactional distance theory. So this is the opposite of what the Flex framework is trying to achieve. So we're trying to look at self-efficacy to get to transformational learning. So therefore, the Flex framework requires us to analyze how the structure of our course and what type of dialogue is occurring in the course relate to each other. To create that self-efficacy in a participant, an understanding of that experience is important. The experience must include how the participant focuses on the experience, how much autonomy they have in the experience, and what type of engagement is occurring in the experience. And again, this all is not determined by the use of immersive technology or the traditional environment, but through the framework itself. Those questions are the underpinning of the Flex framework, and we will see in the next few slides how these questions are applied to a case study of maintenance training next. So let's look there. So here's our framework. Here's what we looked through so far. Now we're going to change it and look at maintenance training next. So maintenance training next is a virtual reality platform used in the Air Force to train crew chiefs, young airmen, in the maintenance training next program. And so to kind of give you a breakdown, on the left here you see is the maintenance training next program and a macro view. Some of the things that were used in the maintenance training next program for virtual reality were things such as the MOTAR dashboard to collect, store, and update and manage student information through their learning experiences. HTX Labs was responsible for creating a VR simulation through video, recording, and playback capability for students and instructors to kind of do specific maintenance tasks in VR. Ario was developing what they call web-based augmented reality videos on tablets for students to do self-study paced on their own back in their dorms. DMI Incorporated created AI coaching interaction to do oversight for the students' hands-on learning in the simulation experiences. And even C2 Technologies provided academic and technical virtual reality and desktop user learning experiences, meeting very specific objectives through 22 different learning scenarios supported by realistic Air Force maintenance environment modules and animations. So all that to say is, like, let's look through and use the Flex model to see how the participants did through the maintenance training next program. And so when we did that, we want to ask these questions. What is the purpose of the experience when we look through the experiential learning process? When we look through flow theory, we must include that optimal learning performance to the learner's affective state. And with transactional distance theory, we need to look at maintenance training next through the relationship between the structure and the dialogue of the maintenance training next program. Again, here's those things we kind of talked about to connect maintenance training next program to what we're going to look at and assess through this program. So as a reminder, that Flex framework requires us to look at the affective state, the use of flow theory through driven of 4 interactive factors, and then that relationship between structure and dialogue. So if we look at some end of course feedback, first we see how we assess it through experiential learning to assess some of the students' end of course feedback underlying question of were there differences, if any, between the hands-on in the virtual environment and the hands-on in the actual environment. Using the lens of experiential learning, you can kind of see some of this potential disconnect in creating the appropriate immersive experience that was not as effective based on some of the participants' feedback that you see highlighted in blue. There are differences, though, in the virtual versus traditional environment. Also, those comments are highlighted here to show how the Flex framework also results in understanding having clear goals and objectives within maintenance training next. So what was the goal or objective of the experience was the question we looked for. And some of the students' comments showed that they didn't understand what the objective was, but the use of immersive technology was applied. So this is the key question when introducing immersive technology into a formal training program. What experience will the immersive technology provide? From this small qualitative assessment of maintenance training next end of course survey, we can see that the need for a better assessment of the experience and the affective state is needed in this part of experiential learning under maintenance training next. Nancy will show us the flow theory end of course feedback results.
So just as we can identify some disconnects between maintenance training next execution and ELT, in our second example from maintenance training next, we also see opportunities for application of flow theory. So in many cases, specific feedback from students highlighted the mismatch between challenge and skill, and we've said that over and over. A desire for direct immediate feedback and confusion about a task goal or expectation, which Andy mentioned. For example, when accomplishing operation of the flight controls, a student commented that the hands-on portion was really difficult because there was a lot of information to learn in that section. This resulted in anxiety until they better understood the task. So if we applied flow, we would really try to be intentional about how we're matching the current level of skill and how those students challenged at that moment. Another theme in responses from students was a desire for clearer expectations. In 3 of the specific tasks involving installation of servicing or hardware, students commented that it was really hard to understand, again, why they were doing the task. So application of flow theory would have driven us to really clear expectations and goals for the student.
Thank you, Nancy. And our last part to look at is through transactional distance theory. In this third analysis, we see to understand and assess participants' comments as it relates to creating either transactional or transformational learning. So reviewing the comments highlighted in blue, we can see the theme occurring from participants' comments. Dialogue with the instructor was key aspect to and supported the immersive technology. So instructor feedback helped create the appropriate structure to the Maintenance Training Next course, not the immersive technology itself. Through communication with the instructors, a stronger connection for those participants was developed. So reviewing these comments highlighted in blue, we can see the theme occurring from participants as dialogue was the most important aspect to the Maintenance Training course, not the immersive technology itself. So as we wrap up, the Flex framework reminds us that the immersive technology cannot be the starting point. The experience, along with reflection through experiential learning, with immediate feedback through various communication mechanisms, transactional distance theory, and proper tasks to challenge, flow theory, is needed to create self-efficacy in any formal training program.
So lots of efforts out there to use immersive technology in learning environments. Many of us recognize the potential to increase efficiency and effectiveness of that training. We suggest that there might currently be a lack of a tool for integrating the technology into existing curriculum. So trial and error, sometimes valuable and necessary, not scalable, not useful for a resource or time-constrained environment. So really what we're ultimately saying is an effort to ensure form is determined by required function and not the other way around should improve process and outcomes for learners and the institution. So we're really thankful for your time this morning, and I think we're ready for questions. Or not, I'm good with that too.
I have a random question that might be a dumb question, but when I
No dumb
hear about
questions.
when I think about this concept of flow that I'm somewhat familiar with, the thing that I'm reminded of this, there was a paper in the 70s about this thing called the zone of proximal development. As I got to think of, how are those two? Are you familiar with that? Are those two related in any way that's important? Or?
Sounds familiar. I'm trying to think. So flow theory really came from the use of online learning. But now it's starting to be looked at and expanded, looking at that theory into other immersive technology, immersive learning platforms. But it sounds familiar. I'm not completely familiar with that term, but that's, I think, similar. You're trying to find that proximal learning zone, right, for the student, right?
And redirecting
And figure out how to keep them
redirecting
in it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in our research and what we look at as this framework is that the starting point is not saying, let's bring in immersive technology into a training program and it kind of, it's like, hey, immersive technology works well, it's pretty effective, it's pretty Gucci, there's some great things about it, so let's bring it in. No, the question should be, are we creating the right flow state? Is the challenge, should that challenge be in VR or should it be in the traditional environment? Sometimes you may need a mix and say, let's not take our training program and now bring it all into immersive technology because I can reduce my training from 32 days to 14 days because I can do it in VR, because you're not really going to create the self-efficacy. And that's what we saw in the end of course feedback with students did not feel prepared coming out of the virtuality program that they may have thought they were going to. And so maybe we need to look more at is technology the right thing just to bring in and replace training environments, but we should be looking at other questions, and that's what the framework is asking you to do.
Awesome, thank you.
You mentioned the Air Force is using maintenance train X. Do you know where they're doing that?
Maintenance Train X, we're going to, at Lackland, at their crew chief course, is where they're doing it at. And so it's now called Tech Training Transformation, so it's got a newer term to it, very similar to Pilot Training X as well, where they've taken parts of training programs, pilot training and maintenance training in the Air Force are the two bigger programs, and using immersive technology to either speed up or help with logistically getting training aspects to it that you had trouble doing in a normal training program. Because in Maintenance Train X, if you want to take airmen out on the flight line to the airplane to practice changing the tire on the aircraft, that's a logistical effort, resources, because I now have to get an aircraft I can use that's not in maintenance depot or being used by operators to go fly a sortie line. And so by bringing in VR, I can reduce that logistics. And those are the questions I think most found when they're going through Maintenance Train Next is those resources are now easier to use, but we're saying the questions we should be looking at is first look at it through the Flex framework before you say, let's just bring in immersive technology because I can reduce resources. So.
Been focusing quite a bit on the immersive technology, specifically when during validation where the instructor quizzes comes back to find out and assess. Did you find that instructors were having to spend more time on perhaps retraining and then reassessment based on an overutilization of immersive technology, and what did that do to the overall efficiency of training?
What we noticed in the end of course feedback from a lot of the students was the instructor was providing different instructional guidance than what was in the VR headsets or in the augmented reality videos. They didn't align with how it's actually applied on the flight line, and so that knowledge didn't come until the instructor provided it to the students in face-to-face. And so we looked at, if we go back and look at the set, you can kind of see where the validation was occurring mostly after the students went through a lot of their immersive technology. There was some dialogue occurring during where most immersive technology was, but it wasn't balanced enough, and that's what we saw in the feedback. And so what was happening in validations, the instructors were actually doing a lot of pre-validation to the students, like, hey, here's what we should do, and the students were like, well, that's not what the VR headset had us do, or that's what the augmented reality video was saying to do. Like, no, well, this is the way we need to do it. And then we'd actually go do the validation. So there's some extra steps that normally you would probably not have if you had kept it more in the traditional environment, where the instructor has more dialogue with the student in the traditional course, because in this version, the students are not having as much dialogue up front because they're doing this stuff all in VR. So the instructor was finding places where they had to kind of re-emphasize or kind of explain the information differently than what the VR immersive technology was telling the students to do. So hopefully that kind of answers the questions.
And not to say that training couldn't take place in that environment, but just that it drives a more intentional touch point for feedback, those intermittent touch points for feedback that still have to be there, even if it is determined that, hey, this is the right environment for this training event. Getting the
One
hook.
quick one in the back, and then we'll wrap up.
Can you bring up the slide that talks about the distance between the instructor and their students? As you're ultimately the goal that you're having us consider is how to create flow for the students, right?
Yeah.
So as we're looking at less structure, we know less structure is harder to control and more dialogue is less cost effective. In a system that is ultimately structured, how do you build unstructured moments? I mean, have you seen, in order to facilitate that flow moment, have you seen that being purposefully being constructed in order to generate it?
I mean, I think that's somewhat the beauty of a virtual or a mixed reality environment, right? This really just is an idea. It's kind of, the start of it. There's probably a lot more research, and work to be done. But I think that's really where the beauty of that environment is, because I can allow it to be less structured. I can allow there to be more risk, potentially. I think it's how you use it. But as far as if we saw that in maintenance training next, I don't think so. But I think that's the key. Like, how do you harness that, and how do you use that?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome. Good job.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for the
Appreciate it.
intro.
Thanks.
Sorry for my ice cold.
Oh, do you? Awesome. Good. I love this.
Probably wear that.
That's right. I know it's my favorite. It's okay.